In art, the terms value or tone refer to the same thing. It's the level or degree of lightness to darkness of any given color. So you can see each and every single color that exists as having its own value or tonal scale, where you have on one extreme the very darkest version of that color, and in the other extreme the lightest version of that color. And value is an incredibly important element of art for us artists to understand and know how to use, because value allows us to develop not only contrast and great impact in our work, but for any of us who are looking to develop any level of realism, it is through value that we're able to communicate believable depth and 3D-ness on a flat two-dimensional surface like paper or canvas. Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Erica, and here I share videos on sketching, watercolor, artist mindset and productivity, and here and there I also share videos on art business. If you're into this kind of thing, make sure to subscribe because it's completely free and it goes a long way in helping ensure that I can keep creating these videos for you to share here. It can definitely be tricky for beginners who are just starting to develop their observational skills to pinpoint light areas and mid-tone areas and darkest areas so that they can then recreate those tonal relationships, make them happen in their drawings or paintings so that they can arrive at the level of realism that they're after. But fortunately, there are exercises that we can do to help us develop these skills. And in this video, I'm going to take you through just that. I'm going to be sharing a process for a value exercise or study that I did of a simple arrangement of 3 apples. I'm going to be explaining step by step how to move through this, as well as essential information that you should know that will help you increase the level of realism in your work. I'll be making the reference photo that I used as I was moving through this available for you for free via a Patreon link that I'm going to be sharing in the description box below. That Patreon post is free and open to the public, and all you have to do is click on that link, scroll down to the bottom of the post, and you'll find the attachments that I created to go along with this tutorial. With all that said, let's jump in. I want to talk a little bit about what I did to prepare my reference photo before getting started with this tonal study. First, I found a great photo of simple objects that had a good level of contrast. I saw very dark areas, very light areas, a nice range of midtones. The photo wasn't over or underexposed, and I have another video where I explain about the main things that I look for in reference photos that I'll be using for art making purposes. I'll make sure to link to that down below in the recommended resources. But after finding a good photo, I desaturated the photo completely or turned it into a black and white photo. And then this is an optional next step. I think it might be helpful, especially if you're just getting started with understanding values and recreating tonal relationships. But if you have a photo editing software, say Photoshop, or right now I'm using Affinity, you could use a filter such as the cutout filter in Photoshop, or in this case, I'm using the posterize filter here in Affinity. And what these types of filters do is they simplify the different value shapes so that you can see them more clearly, turning them into these puzzle pieces that are placed next to each other. And then all you have to do is recreate those shapes in whatever it is that you're drawing, and you're going to end up with believable results. Of course, there are other little things that I'm going to talk about in this video which will help increase the level of realism in your work. I'll be making the full color version of this reference photo, the black and white version of this reference photo, and the posterized version of this reference photo available for you as downloadables at the end of this post so that you can use whichever one you wish to for this study. In this tutorial, you're going to hear me constantly mention the words lights, midtones, and darks. And I just wanted to share this visual with you so that we're on the same page. When I say the word lights, I'm not only referring to the brightest highlight areas, but I'm referring to the first 3 values here, which are the lightest values. when I say the word midtones, I'm referring to the middle of the range values here, which would be value 4 to 6. And when I say the term darks, I'm referring to the darkest values, values 7 to 9. In the beginning of this process, we're basically simplifying all of the different values that we see into just 3 values: lights, midtones, and darks. And just by developing those 3 values in appropriate areas, you will be able to create a sense of depth on the page. But we're going to take our study a little bit further and move on to refining things a little bit more, creating more gradual transitions between value shapes, developing contrast with more layering, and so on and so forth. Let's jump right in. The very first part of this process is, of course, the block-in phase. I am using an HB drawing pencil, and I am making sure to draw lightly so that I can erase mistakes and refine as I go. I also want this work that I'm doing in graphite to be light because I don't want to see my graphite at the end of this process. And I just create something similar, bringing together a group of straight lines. I am not concerning myself with creating perfect curves, and I am sure that I'll be making lots of refinements in these shapes as I move forward, because I don't really know if they are exactly to my liking and what I need them to be until I see these shapes and these lines down on paper, and I have all of these elements there that I can compare with each other in terms of sizes and locations, alignments, angles, and all that kind of thing. But in this first part of the process, I am tuning out the smaller details, and I'm just focusing mainly on getting the sizes of my apples right and getting the locations of my apples right, and doing my best to utilize my drawing space as best as I can. I don't want my apples to be super small, and I don't want my apples to be super large to the point that they don't end up fitting in my page. And if you notice, I started by drawing the middle apple first, near the center of my paper, because I knew that that would enable me to have almost an equal amount of space on my left and right, so that the other apples could also fit and end up relatively centered within my page here. I'll link to other drawing tutorials where I share more about my block-in phase. I sometimes refer to these shapes that I create as an envelope method, where I oversimplify what I'm observing into very blocky shapes. Those will be down below for you in the recommended resources in case you'd like to practice the block-in phase more, because this is foundational in your drawing process. Once my main shapes looked good to me, I moved on to adding in the smaller shapes, little details, which in this case are the stems. I like creating a little curve where the inward top part of the apple goes in that concave section where the stem is coming out. Sometimes I add in little lines or shapes to help me convey that, because the stem is always coming out of that top central dip in the apple structure. Those are important plane changes to take note of, and also it's a good indication of where the stem goes. And once these apples look good to me, I start creating a shape for the cast shadow. I also start creating more gentle curves and taking away the blockiness of those initial shapes that I created. This is a tonal or value study, so it is also very important that we pay attention to the values that these objects are creating on the surface they are on. So that's what I move on to adding next. We see a darker gray shape and a lighter gray shape. I'm going to try to make that happen as I am moving forward to developing my values, because I know that that will lead to more realistic results, as there is often a change of values within the cast shadow area. And if you notice in the reference photo, the filter that I applied in my photo editing software created 2 distinct gray shapes within my cast shadow shape. Once my shadow shapes are in, I start by mapping out the main or most important value changes that I'm able to see in the objects themselves. meaning I am noticing lightest areas, I am noticing darkest areas, and important mid-tone areas. And I'm just starting to create light shapes so that these shapes can help me as I move forward, developing different gray areas, lights, midtones, and darks. And I just want you to simplify what you're observing. Don't worry about small, subtle changes in values. It helps to squint as you're observing that reference photo to just notice those major value changes. What I like doing is really paying attention to where darkest areas are, which will be black or almost black in a grayscale photo, and where the lightest areas are, which will appear white or a very, very light gray in a grayscale photo. See those as abstract, irregular shapes and map those out lightly. I finish up by lightening my sketch with my kneadable eraser, just doing some gentle tapping over my line work. With my preliminary pencil sketch out of the way, it is time to prepare my 2 colored pencils that I'm going to be using for this tonal study. And I'm going to keep this really simple. I am just going to be using a black colored pencil and a 50% gray colored pencil. It's all I'm going to be using. And essentially what we're going to be doing is we're going to be using the black for the darkest value areas, gray for the mid-tone and lighter value areas, and we're going to leave the lightest areas and the highlights free of this pigment. There's going to be more layering done, more of a thicker placement of pigment in darker value areas at the end, whereas the lighter value areas are going to have more of that white paper shining through, helping you create those lighter values and highlights. All right, so the first thing that I'm doing is I'm going over the entire thing with my 50% gray colored pencil, excluding the highlights and lightest value areas. So the main highlights I'm trying to leave uncovered, as well as the lightest value areas that I see. Bring to mind those first 3 values in that graphic that I shared before. Those are the areas that you want to leave uncovered for now. Everywhere else, I am developing a light gray layer in, and I am not pressing down very hard at all. I'm actually just gently gliding the tip of my colored pencil over my paper and trying to fill in these areas relatively quick. If you notice that your lighter value areas are way too large, go into them, but release any pressure that you're exerting on your pencil as you're moving into those areas. And that will help you start creating a soft transition into the lightest values while making them slightly smaller. And don't worry if you go over highlight areas, because the beauty of using colored pencil and going in light initially is that you can actually go in and erase out some of that color later if you need to. I do want to mention that this is meant to be a quicker study, so try not to get too bogged down with trying to achieve super uniform, smooth results as you're filling in these areas, especially when you're filling in these larger areas initially. You will see some sketchiness here, some marks, but as long as you don't arrive at very stark looking lines and marks as you're filling in these large areas, you're gonna do just fine. For me personally, I enjoy a bit of a sketchier look. I do like texture in my drawings and sketches. But this said, I do want to avoid creating lines and marks that may end up being too distracting. But yeah, try not to get too bogged down with this, because that is not really the point of this exercise. Right now we're focusing on learning to pinpoint different value areas so that we can make them happen in our drawings. I'll make sure to link to a video with shading exercises that you can do with regular graphite pencils, which will help you develop better control over your drawing mediums so that you can arrive at smoother results, avoid those stark lines and textures, and create those gradual transitions whenever you want them. Try to let go a little bit more and focus on those different value areas that you're trying to create, and not so much arriving at a very uniform, clean look. All right, so this is what I would consider my first layer. You can see a light gray, and you can also see white areas where I've left that paper uncovered, and those are the highlights and very light value areas that I see. Here, I'm just finishing up this first layer by going in and erasing out some gray from lightest value areas that I want to keep protected or that maybe I darkened a little bit too much. Right now, because I have a very small amount of material on my paper and I haven't burnished at all, it is relatively easy to remove. And now for my second layer, I am going to be using my black colored pencil. I'm now focusing on those 3 darkest values. Refer back to the visual that I shared in the beginning of this video. That is where I'm going to be using this black colored pencil. I'm trying to release any pressure that I'm exerting on my colored pencil as I make my way out from those darkest areas and into the middle of the range mid-tone areas. But at this point in the process, I'm still not really pressing down hard at all. I'm just gently gliding my colored pencil over my paper. And I am still able to see my light graphite work at this point through the layering that I have done because I haven't been pressing down very hard at all. I continue observing my reference photo closely as I go. It is very important to develop your observational skills. And continue asking yourself, is this area here lighter or darker than this other area over here? And see all of these different value shapes that you're developing as abstract, irregular shapes. You can even forget about the fact that you are drawing apples and just see these all as abstract shapes that you are bringing together. I want to avoid getting in any black in lighter midtones, especially and lightest light areas. If you get a little bit of black in darker midtone areas, that is totally fine, but you want to avoid getting black in lighter midtone and lightest light areas. Don't worry too much about sharp changes in values at this point in the process because we will be going through a refinement stage where we go back to our gray and we do more layering. At this point, what I want you to do is just practice simplifying the different values that you're seeing into 3 values: lights, midtones, and darks. Once we get into the refinement stage, we will be doing more layering to help darken areas, create softer transitions, and those bridge tones. All right, so I'm all done with these 3 initial values in the apples, and I am now working on the darker shape inside of the cast shadow. As we continue developing our values, your pencil work that you started this drawing with should start disappearing. If it's not, it's likely that your pencil work is a little bit too dark, and it is important to develop better pencil control so that you can draw lightly, because if you're going for any level of realism, we don't want to see that pencil work, aka outlines, at the end, because in realism there are no outlines. What we're doing through this value work is developing edges. All right, so I'm all done with this initial layering, and as you can see, I have developed lightest areas where I have that paper shining through completely uncovered. I have developed midtone areas, and right now we see a light gray in those midtone areas, and I have developed darker areas where we see a darker gray at this moment. We still have a lot of work to do if we're wanting to push for realism here, and that is where the refinement process comes in. We start paying attention to more subtle changes in values. We start noticing where we have to develop sharp edges or visible edges versus lost edges. We do more layering in areas that we need to darken and push contrast in, and we work on transitions. At this point, I start pressing down a little bit more. I never really do burnishing because I'm not trying to get rid of the tooth of my paper completely. I know some people like doing that, but as I said, I like a little bit more of a textured, sketchier look, so I never really press down too hard, but I am pressing down more firmly at this point, trying to cover up more of that paper and intensifying especially the darkest values that I'm trying to develop, because I know that pushing that contrast is important if I'm looking to develop a level of realism. But at this point, I'm really going back and forth between my gray and my black colored pencils, depending on what I am trying to do. And that is key here. You have to switch between your colored pencils depending on what you're trying to do. If you're trying to develop a darker value, then go ahead and use your black colored pencil. And if you're trying to develop a lighter value, then make sure that you're using your gray. But aside from having the right colored pencil in your hand, it is also essential to shift and change the pressure that you're exerting on your pencil depending on the value that you're trying to create. So if you're going for a dark value but it is not the darkest value, then use your black, but don't exert as much pressure as you would if you were trying to develop those darkest areas. If you're developing middle of the range midtones, then use your gray and you can use a little bit more pressure. But if you're developing lighter value areas, then make sure that you're ever so slightly touching the tip of your gray pencil onto your paper as you're filling in those areas, so that that value can end up looking very light. But at this point, it's a constant back and forth between your drawing and the reference photo, and continuing to compare the two to make sure that those tonal relationships really resemble what is present in the photo. Something that really helps me at this point of the process is taking mini breaks, seeing the drawing from a bit of a distance, and noticing if there are any large areas with one single flat value. So for example, sometimes my highlight areas are too large and they create these large shapes with one single flat value. That is going to lead to flatness in the drawing. If you have large sections with one same value, that area is going to look flat. So pay attention to where there are subtle value changes so that you can make them happen. Another thing that I'm really paying attention to at this point as well is where I have lost edges and where I have defined edges. In realism, you're going to have a combination of both. And what I mean by this is sometimes you're going to see areas where there is a very light value right next to a dark value, and you see that very sharp separation or edge between the two. In other cases, you're going to have a soft, gradual transition between your values. And in other cases, it's very interesting because you're going to have almost the same value inside of your object and outside of your object. This is where edges are lost. And pay attention to these things and try your best to make them happen in your drawing, because the level of realism will be increased if you make this combination happen. Notice how in some sections, there is a darker value inside of the apple and a lighter value outside of the apple. In other cases, there is a lighter value inside of the apple and a darker value outside. And then there are other situations where there is almost the same value both inside of the object and outside of the object. When a lot of us are getting started, we want to create an outline around our objects or subjects and create this very clear limit between what is inside and what is outside. But in reality, that's not what happens. There's always going to be areas where edges are lost. Here I'm working on final refinements, pushing those deepest, darkest shadow areas a little bit more with my black colored pencil, which now I am going in with a little bit more pressure. Sometimes as we are doing our shading and value development, areas that initially looked dark don't look as dark anymore, because we're always going to judge whether an area is light or dark depending on the context, on the values around that area. And so usually we do have to go in to push darkest darks at the end. However, sometimes I've also noticed that beginners struggle with creating those transition or bridge tones. So if you see your piece and you notice that those dark areas are very, very stark looking still, you likely need to work on those midtones in between the darks and the lights. Near the end of the process, I also like going in with sharp pencils and defining some sections along those edges. Not creating outlines, but just darkening along some edges where I do see darker edges in the reference photo. Here I'm going in with my gray again and I'm using this gray to make some highlight shapes a little bit smaller, and I'm softening some transitions. Notice here how I'm going over the edge of my darker shadow shape, adding in that bridge tone between this darker shape that I filled in with black and the lighter shape that I filled in with my gray. Notice the stems. I at no point thought of drawing or shading in an actual stem. I simply focused on creating some darker shapes and some lighter shapes. And at the end, they end up looking like stems within this context. You can also see how now that I'm almost done, my pencil work that I started with is no longer visible. All right, I think I'm ready to call this one done. I'm pretty happy with the range of values that I've developed and the level of realism here. I hope that you enjoyed this tutorial. I hope that you're able to give this one or something similar a go for yourself. Thank you so very much for joining me on this one. I wish you a wonderful rest of your day. Enjoy your art practice and see you very, very soon.